Today on the Life Science Success Podcast, I welcome Josh Seidenfeld. Josh is a partner with Cooley LLP in the Palo Alto office. His practice consists of representing clients and general corporate matters with a focus on emerging companies, private financing, initial public offerings, mergers, and acquisitions. Prior to joining Cooley, he was the Director of Business Development and Corporate Counsel for Practice Fusion, an electronic health record company located in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Don.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself?
Of course, happy to. So again, thanks for having me. I'm a California native, so I originally grew up in the East Bay area and then actually lived back east for a while and ultimately found my way back to California when I went to grad school. So I did a JD MBA right here at Santa Clara University and ultimately decided the passion for me was with the law and in particular working with what I'll say are kind of venture-backed companies or companies that want to be venture-backed in the life sciences in particular. And so I've been doing that at Cooley now for a little over 13 years at the firm. And before that, I've worked at a number of different companies, as you mentioned, and it's looking forward to talking about what that looks like in the life sciences from a legal perspective.
Yeah. So I guess, can you give us a little bit of an example in terms of, your experience with like smaller companies and smaller startups?
Of course. So that's one of the reasons that I like the platform of Cooley so much. The firm's been around for 101 years, and we've essentially been working with startup companies since day one. So once upon a time, that was companies like Genentech. Now, obviously, there's a whole new generation of companies. And for myself, what that means is I work with some companies before they're ever even an entity to begin with. So there's some founders who have an idea. They're not quite sure if it's really a business or if it's something that is financeable. And ultimately, we'll kind of talk through those very, very, very beginning phases of a company of, is there a there ultimately? And what's the right process for getting that company set up if you really think about taking on third-party capital or how you're thinking about liquidity? And then ultimately, I work with those companies all the way through a liquidity event, if that's a sale or it's an IPO, and then everything that happens in between. So for a lot of companies I work with, I'm their outside general counsel.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was actually on a university website, technology transfer website recently, and I saw, Cooley was listed, there as representing one of the companies. I guess it brings me more or less to this point of, whenever you say that you get started extremely early, I mean, it seems to me like the company on this particular website was just starting to be formed.
Exactly. And that's when we get involved with companies. And there's, I think, a real distinct advantage when you do that. I mean, we also get involved, frankly, with companies before their last round of financing or right as they're going public. That happens all the time for us as well. But it's a very different process that you go through. And ultimately, one of the things that brings me a lot of joy in the practice is when you get a chance to meet a founder that has an idea and you literally start to understand what their cost risk profile looks like, how they think about risk generally, and really what drives them and their company. And you would be surprised that as you learn those things, at least for me in my practice, over time, you actually can start to predict, from a legal perspective, exactly where you think real issues are, real hotbed issues are for different teams and companies. And I think that only helps provide better guidance and gets better results, for those founders to begin with. And so forming that relationship and really being vested in the people that you work with, it's a human business. And so I think that's one of the most important factors is kind of that day one experience that you get.
Yeah. And so I guess, just to explore a little bit more in terms of kind of the types of companies that Cooley really represents. So is it both on the drug side as well as the device side, or just primarily in one area or the other?
So it is the full gamut of life sciences is what I would say. It literally spans kind of all subdomains as you think about them. So we work with companies that are, and I do myself, that are in drug discovery, some that are doing therapeutics, others that are doing med device. Nowadays, a lot of companies that are quote unquote digital health companies, which is its own very broad category that can be, delivery or consumer oriented, and telehealth, of course, as well. So it really does kind of span all of those different types of domains. And that's, again, another thing that I enjoy is that you get a chance to really give strategic advice to companies, because depending on what it is that you're doing, the way you'd go about, developing your business and the way you'd go about thinking about the right investor pool and the amount of capital that you'd raise at different data points, it is different. Like, it's strategically different depending on the type of company that you're running and what you think your ultimate end goal is.
Yeah. And I guess in terms of representation overall, do you stay with companies generally forever? I mean, once the initial relationship is formed, do you just stay with them throughout up to that point where they're either, they go public or they have an M&A event?
We do. And that's exactly how we work with companies. So we'll, meet with the founding team, we'll work with them, and we'll watch over time. All of a sudden, within a year, they'll raise their first round of capital. And our legal team, of course, will grow with them, because initially the team might just be myself and a paralegal and associate. Over time, we may have 2 or 3 associates on the team. And then all of a sudden, the company starts growing really quickly and they're hiring a lot. So they need someone that's more dedicated in employment. And we will continue that process all the way through. And so there are some clients I work with now that I literally remember, filing their initial certificate of incorporation, and now, I'm helping them do their 34 Act reporting work, because they're, a public company with ongoing responsibility to their stockholders. And it's a lot of fun when you kind of have that breadth of a company, because what's really interesting is over time, folks that are there leave and start other businesses. And so for a lot of companies that have gone down that path, I might be the second most senior person there besides one of the founders. So it's a lot of fun to be part of that.
Yeah. Well, and the one interesting thing I think in your comment, right, is that, so I've been with companies that are kind of, as the blitzscaling book kind of describes this idea of having like a very small company being, kind of family sized, and then you have village sized companies, and then you have nation sized companies, which are really big. And the one thing that really rings true to me is that I've seen, legal representation just get swamped by all of the different things that they have to do in one given day. And what I'm hearing you say is that you guys really kind of, you try and scale to meet that need, which is probably a good thing for the companies that you represent.
Oh, exactly. It is. I mean, we're 1,100 lawyers across the world. And so as, a company grows or starts to develop teams, even in different geographic regions, we, kind of grow with them and work with them. That's a very natural process. And so it's not you outgrow your law firm. And we do see that. I mean, that happens in other situations where, look, costs are always a real issue. And so there are a lot of founders that say, okay, I want to try to have, the biggest cost savings I can on legal, because that's a, quote unquote, pure cost center for me. And ultimately what ends up happening is you may start with a small shop and you get to a place where you are blitzscaling, to use your terminology here. And all of a sudden you go, I need more horsepower and I need more expertise, or maybe there's something I'm missing, because there are a lot of pitfalls that you can run into when you're running a company. Some can happen in the very beginning. You might miss an opportunity for yourself, and some can happen in later stage, financings, or even as you're a public company. And so being able to get that type of guidance and know that those people are going to be with you the full way, there's value in that. And like I said, obviously there's, for us, there's a lot of reward in kind of being part of that process at the end of the day, without taking that direct risk of being the actual entrepreneur. So, it's a nice dichotomy there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's just an interesting balance, because you have this whole thing of new contracts and new agreements coming in from potentially new clients for the company that you're representing. Just to describe a little bit of what I've seen in the past in terms of the chaos, and then you have, on top of that, let's say the company wants to go public. You have all the filing papers and everything else that goes along with that. And what I've seen before is one attorney responsible for everything, and maybe they have maybe another attorney helping and some paralegals, but at the same time it's just kind of just mad chaos overall. And it is interesting to hear how Cooley approaches that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fair point. And that's one of the things that I think we end up being very helpful with too, is that we do try to make sure that you have a best available athlete approach to the team. And so we're not an expert in what we do. I mean, we're not going to put someone forward for that particular project. And there are always, categorical areas that you may not be thinking about. So if you're let's say you're a scientific co-founder and you're an academic professor, as an example, and you decide, okay, I'm going to go, start a company. Maybe you don't have all the financial chops that you'd want. And ultimately you start, let's just say entering into contracts, and those contracts have payment terms. And so you're actually going to generate some revenue on them. Well, the last thing that you're thinking about is probably how important are those payment terms in the context of what if we sell? And ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, when you sell a company, there are things like working capital that you have to deal with, and there are adjustments if you don't make sure that you have clear visibility on when payments come in. And all of a sudden, those contract terms that you were signing 4 or 5 years ago, there's a light shine right on them. And it's real money to someone that has spent, the last, whatever it is, 7 years of their life building a business. And so being able to help someone see around that corner and make sure that, their agreements are ready for those situations, that's fun for me at the end of the day, but I think helpful at least for the people we work with, or at least we try to be helpful that way.
Yeah, it's a perfect transition for the next area of the interview that I'd like to go. So I want to go on a little bit of a journey, primarily based on one particular friend that I have who sent a message out to several of us in the life science space, just saying kind of last minute, hey, look, I've got to look at where I'm going to incorporate. And it was a very sort of last minute, kind of decision. And it was one of those moments where I kind of stepped back and went, really, I would think that we would probably want to put a little bit more thought into this. And then I think we can kind of maybe step through the life cycle a little bit more in the interview as well.
Sure. It's a fair point. And I do see a lot of that. I mean, we'll have clients that come in that will have started a company in basically just the state that they live in for whatever reason, because that was the easiest thing for them to do. And ultimately there is, some decision-making process that people should go through. It's not the most complicated thing in the world. And we do have resources, by the way, that are available for people that you can use anytime. They're without cost. So we have an open source platform that we put together that we're really proud of. It's called CooleyGo.com. And one of the articles that I actually wrote when we put this platform together actually is about corporate basics and entity formation selection, ironically. And so I went through some of the basics there of, do you want a C corporation? Do you want an LLC, an S corp? What about a public benefit corporation? And for different companies, one of those may make sense. And then the jurisdiction that you're thinking about is, should it be a California entity? Should it be a Delaware entity? Why does everyone seem to choose Delaware? I mean, does that really make sense for your company or not? And these are the kinds of things that, I think you could read about and get some background from the Cooley Go site I was mentioning, or obviously counsel can help you think through. But to me, that becomes, it's actually a bit more simplistic at the end of the day, which is, if you really think you're going to try to raise third-party capital, and that's the world that I work in, is folks that want to raise venture at the end of the day, then there are some entities that most venture funds aren't able to finance, because some of their LPs, their limited partners, are pension funds, as an example, or they're subject to additional constraints on pass-through vehicles. So LLCs and S corps are not attractive for those types of investors. And so ultimately that leaves you with, you're looking at a corporation, and then you start thinking about what's a body of law that is tried and true and it is favorable for companies. And Delaware, still to this day is, the most favored, by folks like myself, because it's basically the most flexible, I think, at the end of the day, for how a company operates. And so that's one of those areas where you could start in the wrong place, and it could be a $20,000 issue to begin with, or even more expensive if you're fixing way down the road. So you don't want to just skip over it, or certainly make it a last minute decision.
Yeah, and so I guess the other question that I would have in that same vein as well is that, does it really matter where you incorporate versus where you live? I mean, back to the original starting point of, you've run into lots of founders who will pick, their home state as a place to incorporate.
It does. It really does matter, and there are substantial differences at the end of the day in different states' bodies of law that would govern how your company needs to operate. Now, there are some laws. If you're hiring people, as an example, in California, you're going to be subject to California law when you're talking about employment matters. You're going to use California compliant employment agreements and IP assignment documentation. And that same thing would be true if we're talking about Texas or Florida, or name your state. It would all be true in that regard. Or if you have folks that you're hiring abroad even. But when you start thinking about the actual corporate aspect of the company, and you say, okay, well, one day if I sell my company, who do I need to get approval for to sell it? And what type of notice do I need to give people? And how much are the filing fees and how complicated are the filings to do? There are some jurisdictions that are more complicated to work through, and there are just more considerations that you have to make in order to operate your business in those states. In my experience, Delaware tends to be the most flexible and allows things to get done the fastest. And that's why there are so many companies that start as Delaware corporations at the end of the day. One of the points, though, that I think is important is if you are an executive of your company and you are living in another state, even if you decide you want to form as a Delaware corporation, you're still going to have to qualify that business in the jurisdiction that you live. And so you'll hear this terminology sometimes called a foreign qualification. And that's basically because you're taking an entity from Delaware, which is foreign to every other state, and you have to qualify it to do business in that other state that your executive lives in, or maybe where you have an office in. Every state has a corporate code, and it basically explains what, transacting business is or what it isn't in the state. And so you kind of figure out as your company's growing if you have to qualify in multiple states. So when you start becoming commercial and you have offices in 30 different states, you might be qualifying in all 30 of those states.
Very good. And so now in the next step of the journey, right? So let's say, I've incorporated, I've got some new technology, whatever. Now the next sort of consideration might be, patenting, things that might have slipped through the cracks or that I haven't thought about before. Is that something that Cooley also helps clients with?
We do. I mean, we're a full service firm, so we help folks with all aspects of their startup. And so whether it's your IP portfolio from a patent or trademark copyright perspective, also thinking about, how are you making sure that you're compliant with, software that you're using, because more and more companies are using things like open source software. And if you don't use that correctly, that can, result in some hefty penalties or additional fees or even code disclosure to the general public. And so we help folks through all of those kinds of things. One of the big things, though, that I think people typically miss, and so I'll try to share this with you too, is when you're forming a company, a lot of times, especially for first-time founders, everyone just thinks very simplistically of, okay, I'm just going to issue myself some equity in the company. So I'm the, quote unquote, I'm the owner, right? I'm the sole stockholder. Or maybe you have a co-founder and you're thinking about how to, give yourself equity. But one of the things that people don't think about is, what is the way that I also can be the most tax efficient with the equity that I acquire in a company? Because one of the key advantages of acquiring equity is that one day you're hoping to sell it for a lot more than you acquired it for. And you want to make sure that you're, being smart about tax strategy. And so one of the things that you will hear about is this concept of qualified small business stock. And maybe that's something, Don, you've heard of before as well. But essentially, if you acquire stock in an early company, that stock, if you hold on to it for 5 years, allows you for better tax treatment than you'd get even than capital gains, and certainly better than ordinary income. And so sometimes you will see a founder that has had multiple successful exits. When they go start their next or their third company, they will actually try to acquire their initial stock, not just in their own name, but they'll try to acquire it through a trust or an IRA or other entities because they want to avail themselves of greater QSBS, possible exposure. And so there are things that, you may miss over that seem so simplistic, but there are huge, ultimate economic consequences between, just having stock issued to yourself or, for example, some in the name of a trust. If you have a family, as an example, that could be a nice boon or windfall for you.
Yeah. So, in terms of, other key pitfalls that people, might find, in starting up a company, are there other, sort of things that you've learned in the space that you would like to warn people about?
Happy to. So I think one thing to me is not putting enough focus in, how you're structuring your cap table vis-a-vis you and the rest of your team. And not just how you're holding the dynamic against one another, but what that looks like to third parties that you go to market for. So eventually, if you're going out and raising capital, and if you and a co-founder are going to hold your stock 50-50, you will sometimes get the question from an investor of, okay, who's really in charge here? Who's the person that's actually going to make the final decision? And when you go try to talk to an investor who's used to seeing 20 or 100 different pitch opportunities every single day that they comes across their desk, you want to make sure that the messaging is clear, even down to that level of detail. So even if you're splitting 55-45, because ultimately you have someone who is, quote unquote, responsible for final decision making, and that's your, usually your CEO, doesn't have to be, of course. You want to make sure you're also being able to signal that. And then you got to think as well about, look, I have a co-founder and it's someone who's not going to be here full time, or they have other, financial obligations. Don't let them join the company. Does it really make sense to issue that person, 20% of the company as an example? How is an investor really going to look at that? And so those types of things, to me, are really paying attention how you're structuring your cap table initially, really important. How you're thinking about vesting as a general sense is really important. So even if you and your co-founder are obviously never going to leave your company and you're never going to fire one another, you have to think about, well, what happens when we hire our 50th employee and someone comes in and says, I want some term that's non-standard? It's a lot easier negotiation when you can say, look, even the founders, when we started this company, put in, kind of standard, vesting terms. And nowadays that's still a 4-year vest with a 1-year cliff typically. Very, very helpful for you as you're kind of setting the tone of the company. I think one of the other key things I'd raise is, making sure that even from day one, you're really thinking about, are you building kind of a cohesive functional strategy across all your different, all your different business functions, including things like IR. Now you start out, you don't have any investors, but you always have prospective investors, and capital raising is something that you're constantly doing as an entrepreneur or a founder. Even if it's not something that you want to do, it's kind of written into the job. And so making sure that you're thinking about who is the next group of investors that I would want to have as part of my company. What's the messaging I want to be sharing with them? So when it's time that I'm going to go to market, they already have a sense of what we're doing. They already know that we're executing against plan, and you're starting to kind of create the dynamic of, it's not really kind of a cold introduction, but it's really more refamiliarizing oneself with the business itself. That to me is something that a lot of people miss that, and they make it more difficult when they try to go out and raise starting from scratch. I guess the third thing that I would raise too is just making sure that at the end of the day, you're also fundamentally thinking about, what's the culture of the company that you're trying to build, and how you're thinking you're going from where you are today to the ultimate end goal. And part of that is, a lot of times people will start to weigh things in the immediate term versus thinking more about the long term of their company. And so the best example that I usually go to is, I'll refer to it as kind of like dilution sensitivity. So, a lot of times an entrepreneur will think, I want to go find the investor that's willing to pay the highest price possible to invest in my company. But if you're a drug discovery company and you know that you have to go through clinical trials and you'll have to raise a lot of money to do that, the truth is it's not necessarily finding the investor that's going to pay the most. It's finding a pool of investors that are going to be able to support that company over its life. And so sometimes, you're making those kinds of trades to where you can be sure that you're going to give yourself the best opportunity to achieve the final outcome, and maybe, having a small cost adjustment in the immediate term in order to have that type of vision.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the fundraising area, right, is one area that I know I've had a lot of, experience in talking to companies about myself, that, there's just an awful lot of work that needs to go into it. And some companies I feel like have very smartly positioned people to nonstop be, sort of looking for other fundraising opportunities, whether it's the CEO or somebody else. That may vary, but what I have seen is that, they at least will have somebody that's more or less dedicating, their life to looking for what is that next opportunity. And I think you bring up a really good point. Are they doing it also in a smart way, not just finding the dollars, but also being smart about, getting that next round that will carry them forward, but also, back them up long term?
Yep. No, exactly. And I always try to remind entrepreneurs at the end of the day that when you're out fundraising, it is a relationship that you are forming. I mean, it is like a marriage that you are forming. And if you start to read through a term sheet of a priced financing round, you start to look at the governance documents that typically get put together. There is no, quote unquote, just an easy breakup if you decide it doesn't work out. I mean, both parties need to agree that you are going to separate at the end of the day. And so you have to make sure that you're finding the right partner that fits the way that you want to run the company and has some strategic guidance for you. It's not just the capital at the end of the day. And I know that's a phrase that you probably hear or read about all the time, but it's so true that it's just important to emphasize for people.
Yeah, and to pick up on the culture aspect as well. I mean, it's funny because since establishing my own business, the number one thing that I look for is whether or not if I feel like I can be a cultural fit for somebody that actually is looking to hire me. And if the cultural fit isn't there, then I sort of try and provide other people that they might want to take a look at, as an opportunity just to help out. I'm more than happy to help point in a direction that will provide assistance. But if the culture doesn't match, it's one key thing that you should identify, I feel like, early. And it probably is the same thing whenever it comes to finding financing. We all want to grow our business. We all want to sort of find that next round of funding. But at the same time, if the fit doesn't feel right, there's probably in the cultural area, there's probably another spot to sort of just say, hey, look, let's just take a pause and consider other options.
It's exactly right, and it's funny. I remember when I was a young puppy associate attorney, and I remember looking at some of the partners I was working with and noticing that it seemed like clients gravitated towards partners that were like them at the end of the day. And the same thing I find is true in my own practice now, where it's a dynamic that you find with people where you have an interpersonal connection because you are forming a team. And that same thing holds true with an investor. They are part of your team at the end of the day. And you have to have that right dynamic and fit, because at some point you're going to have to make tough decisions. At some point, something isn't going to go the way that you originally intended to go. And that's where you want people that you trust and people that think either like you or think in a way that's different than you, that's valuable for the company, so you can give yourself the best chance of success. Because if you look at the numbers, at the end of the day, no one would ever start a company, because it's not like there's a huge probability of success, yet ultimately lots and lots of people do. And it really just comes down to, it's not usually the idea that makes the company successful. It's the team of people and how they execute on it.
So Josh, there are 3 questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
I'm ready for these questions, and I'm looking forward to them. So for me, what inspires me is really the entrepreneurs I work with, and it's one of the reasons I like working in the sciences. So not to say there's anything wrong with supporting technology companies. I think that's great as well, but actually having an opportunity to be part of a team where you're making a real difference. So you're bringing a product to market to help someone that has a medical disease, where you're changing the standard of care. Those kinds of things to me just like are profoundly impactful, and they just resonate so much. That's one of the things that excites me, of why I like getting up every day.
Great. And what concerns you?
What concerns me, I'll go into my own sphere in the legal industry, which is nowadays a lot of what we end up doing for companies, and we're training young attorneys, it's all using a lot of computer technology so we can become efficient. And when you're using that computer technology, I always worry that the next generation of attorney is going to start missing out on some of the other really important things around the soft skills, and also just the deep dive of details of going and reading a code book and understanding exactly why I rule the way that it is. And so as I get older, that concerns me more. And so maybe I'll date myself that way, but it's always something top of mind.
Yeah, it's funny because I was a guy. So, I mean, I'm obviously not an attorney, but at the same time, I was the guy that would not give up paper books for a number of years. And so I could relate, at least from that aspect. I enjoyed holding a paper book for a number of years. Now, of course, my Amazon Kindle collection way outweighs my bookshelf collection I currently have behind me. So yeah, for sure, I could relate to that.
Excellent.
And what excites you?
What excites me is getting a chance to be part of a team every day. So I'm a former athlete. So I grew up. I was a multi-sport player, and I played basketball in high school and in college. And so being part of that team environment is something that really does excite me. And the opportunity I have here, where I work with lots of companies as part of their team, and helping them navigate through what is basically a handful of kind of their most strategic transactions they ever do. That is never lost on me, of kind of how important those deals are. Even if, I do 10 of them in a month, and it's, the first one for a founder at the end of the day, that trust is something that's really important to me. And that's, one of the things I'm really grateful for those opportunities.
Yeah, it's always great to play a team sport even in business, and I can definitely relate to that. So, Josh Seidenfeld, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I greatly appreciate you being on the podcast.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye.